Yeah, we always try to keep abreast of both what local rules, regulations are in place or coming, as well as what's happening in other schools. There's been an awful lot of conversations amongst other schools through some of the different listservs, different model policies are exchanged. Um, Here, for instance, at Belmont, we have a couple of factors that would affect drones. One is obviously school policy. Two is, you may know, the emergency communication center is here at the top of the hill. That's a sensitive area, so there are sensitivities to flyovers. Obviously, they would have a concern if drones were buzzing above their facility unauthorized. So that's another element of that. So anytime we use a drone on campus, for instance, if there's a construction project that they're going to take pictures of, we have to be very careful about coordinating with the Emergency Communication Center, with the Office of Emergency Management, with the Metropolitan Police Department, because there is a lot of concern from people these days when they see anything like that about whether or not it may represent a potential risk or threat to them. Here on campus, one of the things we've talked about is whether or not we need a drone policy, and it makes sense that if you have emergency technology, you try to stay ahead of it as far as providing guidance. Um, with the drones, one of the things we've talked about is linking it to event registration. And so generally, the use of drones is guided by this principle. If you want to use a drone, you need to do this because we don't want members of our Belmont community to get in trouble for flying a drone over the emergency communication center, or flying a drone in an area where it may be perceived as invasion of privacy. And so another example of that recently would be the hoverboards. There's a lot of communication about the hoverboards. What do you do? What are the safety issues with the boards themselves? What are the fire safety issues from the chargers? There's been a lot of coverage of that. And so we try to be very deliberate in both staying abreast of the technologies and looking at what other schools are doing, looking at what may be local impacts, but then ultimately saying, what is Belmont's take on this? Because what they do at 20 other schools may not be what is right for Belmont, and I think that's great. But we always try to take the impacts on our neighbors very seriously. Last thing we'd want would be to generate animosity to neighbors and go, yeah, this is a Belmont drone project, so we're going to buzz your private residence with drones for the next 2 weeks. Well, obviously that's the sort of thing where you go, we need to be careful and deliberate and be cognizant of the impacts we have beyond the boundaries of our institution.
For sure.
Now, the rules and regulations on drones and what they are, where you're allowed to fly them, the regulations are constantly changing. How would you suggest students stay updated?
I think when you're unsure, you can always ask. And I would always go back to that, because you can look at a lot of it is under the FAA guidelines now, but you're right, they do change, and so obviously you can Google those things. But I would always ask campus security or residence life or whomever the point of contact is for those. One of the things about campus security is we're the default. So if you called me and said, can I do this with a drone? I may know the answer if it's kind of flat over the emergency communication center, not without their permission. But a lot of times we get questions where we're not the subject matter experts on it. And so probably 80% of the questions we come through like that, the response is, I don't know, let me check, let me get some guidance on that, and then we'll talk to those who are involved. In the case of drones, it may be Andrea over at Event Services. It's probably April over in Risk Management. It may be somebody in communications to see how they do that. You always have to be concerned about how are people going to perceive whether or not there's a risk. And so all those things. And so generally, if you send me an email about whether or not we can do an interview about drones, I want to talk to 2 or 3 people and say, is anybody else talking about this? Is anybody else handling this? If so, what are the key points from the institution standpoint? What do we need to, who needs to be involved in this response? Because really we're responding at an institutional level. So I think it was unclear on the front end in some areas who had the regulatory responsibility over drones. Was it FAA? Was it local authorities? Where did that fall? And so I think it's ultimately come out under FAA. And so I think you'll continue to see those clarifications